Alone in the deep, dark woods, you're sure to find some strange and disturbing things. Creatures that used to be human, entities that defy explanation, a man laying eggs, the list goes on and on. Perhaps you're better off staying home. Enjoy these allegedly true and scary stories about being alone in the woods. I used to live on a rather remote farm in the middle of Norway. My home is located at the end of a fjord that will take you out to the sea, and after a while, to civilization and the big city. You can also drive into town in about 4.5 hours from my home, but this is more or less just to give those listening a sense of scale. I have 2 neighbors about 40 minutes away from my home, but they're seldom at home, so I am for the most part alone with my dogs and farm animals, sheep mostly, and a few pigs. A little information about me. I am a 30-something born and raised in the hinterlands, so to speak. I grew up without much in the way of neighbors or nearby friends. I spent much of my time helping around the farm or out in the woods with my dog in tow. Around the place that was my home, there are deep woods, and looming above is tall mountains and deep valleys overgrown by thick forest and heather meadows. I hunt these lands in the hunting seasons, but there are places I do not go due to how remote they are, or how hard they are to get to and such. But this year, I found myself pressed for income as the Rona prevented me from having hunters come here to hunt deer, grouse, and moose. Now, this is relevant to my experience, due to my reliance on these guests for keeping my finances in good order. So I was faced with the prospect of having to send all my livestock to the slaughter, and I would have to accept my inability to keep the family farm afloat. Ever since my rather unpleasant experience in the woods as a 16-year-old hunter, I made a vow to myself that I would never hunt that stretch of woods again that belongs to the property that I now own. Having grown a lot older and far more calloused when it came to things considered odd or supernatural, I rethought this vow. I got an extended quota for deer and roe deer, and I decided to make a profit from selling the game to a local who sells to hotels and fancy restaurants in town. On the last week of deer and roe deer season before Christmas, I found myself deep into the high valley side amongst the heather meadows and sparse pine woods. I'd left my pickup on the gravel road that ran along the fjord, and I began to hike up the valley side with my hunting dog and rifle in hand, looking for red deer. I'd been on the move for about 3 hours when the weather changed. A thick fog rolled in and blanketed the terrain. I stopped and looked around while I got my compass out. That's when the first odd thing happened. My dog stopped dead in his tracks and began to shiver as if he was cold or, what came to my mind shortly after, nervous. He tucked his tail between his legs and the shivering got more intense. Then, with a yelp that I can only describe as one of sheer terror, he bolted down the steep valley side. I yelled and whistled in an attempt to stop him before he hurt himself. There are bears, wolves, and lynx around where I live, and the addition of the odd invasive wild boar made me more than a bit worried. Raising my rifle, a spring-filled .30-06, I looked around, attempting to see what had caused my dog to panic like that and to flee. I called out to scare away any nearby animals or to make any nearby hunters aware of my presence. But the chance of any other hunters being on my lands was slim and none, as I do not sell many licenses for red deer or roe deer. I got no response, and only the utter silence of the woods and meadows filled my ears. It was then the sounds of labored breathing and something resembling the odor of pinewood resin mixed with wet fur that was very filthy filled the air. Anyone who has worked with sheep who graze outside and has had the unpleasant job of handling said animals will know how wet, filthy, and unkempt wool will reek. At this moment, I felt a long-suppressed feeling of silent dread beginning to creep into my bones. I started to back down the valley side, keeping a keen eye on the ground as not to stumble, but also to look for any signs of whatever was lurking nearby. I hoped it was just my mind distorting the common sounds and smells of the woodland. Having put some 500 meters behind me, the sounds and smells still hung around. At that moment, I decided that I needed to warn whatever this thing was. So I raised my rifle, and in rapid succession, I fired 4 shots into the air so as not to wound any unlucky critter. In my most nightmarish dreams, I could never have imagined the response I got. Oh! A deep guttural howl followed by what can only be explained as something of great height and weight, making its rage known. A stone the size of a rucksack came hurling down about 10 feet above my head and landed with a great crash far down below. I'm not ashamed to admit at this moment I soiled myself as I ran like a whipped hare down the steep valley side. I dropped my rucksack and binoculars somewhere in that valley side. The only thing I kept a firm hold of was my rifle. A primal instinct in me told me I needed something to defend myself. Although what chased after me, screaming in primal rage, would likely not have been fazed by my gun. Heck, I doubt anything short of several .338 Win Mag rounds to the body would have done anything short of annoying it. I burst out of the woods along the gravel road and ran until I could taste a mixture of blood and bile in my mouth. Upon reaching my vehicle, I vomited all over my boots and felt like my heart was about to explode from fear. Looking around to see if my pursuer was still after me or lurking around, I smelled no stench of wet wool and feces. The only thing I may have smelled then was my soiled pants. I shouted for my dog for a long while until my nerves caused me to climb into my vehicle, driving as fast as I dared along the gravel road until I saw my home. Climbing out of my car and walking on legs that felt as if they were made of gelatin, I felt as if my heart stopped when I saw my dog. He was a mess, muddy, his fur thick with twigs and heather, his eyes wide with exhaustion. I fumbled with my keys and unlocked the door and let myself in along with my dog. In the hours after, I showered, cleaned myself up, and took care of my dog, but my mind and body were ravaged with fear. Every sound I heard made me nearly jump. I did not sleep that night, and when my significant other came home, she commented on how worn out I looked and how equally strung out my dog was. This took place some weeks ago. Last week I was out with the garbage when that smell of wet wool and pinewood resin filled my nostrils again. Now I'm lost for what to do. I'll be darned if I end my days in the woods. But who knows? Time will tell. I grew up in the 80s, deep in the woods of West Virginia. My mom and dad were very loving and caring parents who spent a lot of time with me and my older brother. And I think that rubbed off on us because my older brother and I were the best of friends. We shared the same interests, spent much of our time together, and could count on each other. I remember one time when some neighbor kids stumbled upon our house. Mom and Dad weren't home, and my brother was busy with chores in the house. I was outside just playing with my old toy truck in the dirt. I recall hearing footsteps. I looked up and saw two older boys coming my way. I thought this was weird because we didn't have any near neighbors. Even again back then, kids didn't have much to do inside the house, and busy parents would often let their kids roam about. So when I saw these two, I figured they had come from a couple of miles away. Some other house way out here in the woods. Now at first, when I saw them, I was excited at the prospect of having some new friends to play with, being a trusting youngster and all that. When they got close, I gave them a howdy, and they began to step on my toy truck, breaking off the wheels in one fell swoop. I had no idea why they would do that before they even said a word, just as I was about to ask what was wrong with them. They pushed me in the dirt, and I began to cry. I guess that commotion was enough to alert my brother, who was a few years older than me and much taller. He came right outside, picked me up, and socked the larger of the two boys right in the face. He fell in the dirt, crying, and the two then ran off back into the woods where they came from, I guess. It was the weirdest thing. Why would two strange kids, without a word, come and do something like that? I could only guess that they had some trouble at home, and were taking out their frustrations on the first other kid they met that they could overpower. Anyway, I was grateful for my brother being there. My brother was the one who taught me to fish. He was there when I caught my first bass. I was so excited. Dad showed me how to cook it up for dinner, and we enjoyed it as much as we could. I do admit I may have left a couple of bones in there, but I tried my best. One of my fondest and longest-lasting memories of my brother and my family is that of the clubhouse. My dad was a masterful woodworker, and one spring he had a lot of time off from work. I can't remember why exactly, but being a couple of bored and excitable boys, My brother and I asked my dad to help us make a clubhouse in the nearby woods. We caught him at a great time because I don't think he even considered saying no. But that may be due to the fact he had a lot of spare wood in the backyard, a pile of stuff that was just taking up space. Firstly, he had the two of us go out in the woods and pick a spot. We wanted a place that would stand against time. Even as kids, the two of us knew that we wouldn't always live here, and that meant some strangers might live in our house, and they could stumble upon this clubhouse, and that made us think they might wreck it. Then all our work would go to waste. Luckily, there was a specific place my brother and I had in mind that was quite secretive. There was this large tree with strong branches. It sat just under a sheer cliffside, and the easiest way down the cliffside was a hill that was covered in masses of brambles and thorn bushes. Basically, people might find the clubhouse, but they would be hard-fought to get to it. So we picked that tree, we showed Dad where it was, and he told us it was quite a distance away, so we'd have to help him get the wood out here. But we already expected that. Over the next few months, we'd make time almost every day to put together the clubhouse 2x4 by 2x4, nail by nail until it was done. That thing was a wooden monument. It had one of those drop-down rope ladders attached to a string that was really hard to see in the daytime, so we could toss the rope ladder back up when we crawled down, and only we would know how to get it back down with the string. Plus, it was especially roomy, thanks to how big the tree was, and thanks to my dad's woodworking. With a roof and a makeshift door on it, it was the perfect place to spend sleepovers. And by sleepover, I usually mean my brother and I camping out in the treehouse, which we usually just referred to as the clubhouse. We spent an untold number of nights there, sometimes laying in the clearing nearby and counting stars, other times in the clubhouse, telling ghost stories, making sure the rope ladder was pulled up, just in case anything creepy decided to climb up inside with us. When we did have friends from school over, they thought it was the coolest thing they'd ever seen. In my teenage years, my brother would show me comics, which I grew to love as well, so we'd often spend some quiet hours reading comics up in the clubhouse. With how often we were out there, I'm sure my parents were either worried about us or thankful for all the free time they got. But not every moment at the clubhouse was a cheery one. I remember when I was 13 years old. My brother must have been around 16 or 17. He wanted to sleep in the clubhouse again and invited me to stay with him. But I had a fever, as I'd been sick, and that muggy outdoor air, especially at night, it made me feel so much worse. So I told him I'd just be staying in my room that night. He was understanding about it. About an hour after sundown, he took off with some food, a sleeping bag, and a backpack, as well as a kerosene lantern. A couple of hours after that, everyone back at the house was in bed. I was asleep until I suddenly heard a banging at the window. I shot straight up out of my bed, startled, with goosebumps all over my back and neck. I looked to the nearby window, the one closest to facing the direction of the clubhouse. I saw a silhouette of a boy. I rubbed my eyes and turned on the light, and there stood my brother, just outside the window. And though I'd heard him banging on the glass, he was now facing away from the glass, staring into the woods. At first I walked over and tapped on the glass to get his attention, to let him know I was awake. Then I reached down and began to pull up on the window. When the window was open, my brother didn't budge. He still stared quietly into the dark woods nearby. Hey, are you okay?" I groggily asked him. I waited for a response for an awkward amount of time, but he stayed silent. It was so bizarre. I'd never seen him act like this, and I was worried he was scared of something out there. Maybe he saw a bear or was chased by coyotes. Worried, I reached out my hand and grabbed his shoulder. The moment I did, I happened to look down and saw his feet. Now, my brother and I always wore shoes outside, as it made exploring the nearby woods easier and less painful, what with all the random rocks scattered about. So when I looked down and saw that his shoes were gone, and saw instead his feet covered in mud and blisters, I became concerned. "Hey, what happened?" I tried to ask when he suddenly interrupted me. "May I come in?" He spoke in a strangely low voice. It was monotone. I didn't really understand it, but he soon repeated himself. "May I come in?" What? You live here? Why are you asking me to come in? I told him. I smirked a little bit, but I think it was only for my own comfort because everything about this situation was bothering me. May I come in? He said again, completely disregarding everything I'd said. I rolled my eyes and was just about to tell him to come in when those goosebumps came back twofold. Something felt incredibly wrong. Well, I began to say, but then I looked up above his shoulder and to the distance, and in the trees, standing there, waving, was my brother. A sudden banging at the window behind me in the room caused me to nearly scream. I turned around, my hand no longer on my brother's shoulder, but there was nothing at the other window. When I turned to face forward again, the boy that had been standing in front of me, faced the other way, was gone, and my brother was running towards the window now. The real brother, the one whose face I could see, the one with panic in his eyes and expression. This one came towards the window, and when he got close enough, he did not ask permission. He jumped inside, nearly tackling me as I stood there dumbfounded. He picked himself up, breathing heavily, and closed the window. Right away I looked down, and I saw that he was wearing shoes. Everything about this brother looked perfectly normal, except for the face he was making when he turned around. "You didn't say yes, did you?" He immediately asked me. I got chills. "What? No, I didn't." "Thank God," he replied. He turned to look out the window and scanned the surroundings out there. "What happened? What's going on?" I asked. "I don't know," he explained. "I was in the clubhouse and I just got done reading some comic books and was about to go to sleep. I turned off the lantern and I closed my eyes. A moment or two later, I felt something hitting the tree below. I thought it was someone trying to get my attention, maybe you or Dad. I opened the door and looked down, and I saw Dad standing there, but he was facing the other way. I couldn't see his face. I called out to him, but he didn't respond, and eventually he said something weird. He asked me if he could come up, but his voice was all wrong. Dad knew where the pull string was to let the rope ladder down, and yet he kept asking me if he could come up, repeating the same thing over and over no matter what I told him. I closed the door, then covered my face in the sleeping bag. Eventually it was gone, or he was gone, I guess, because he finally stopped asking me if he could come up. After a few minutes, I got so scared and freaked out by that, I ran home. But then I saw Dad standing there, at the bedroom window, still facing away from me, looking at you through the glass. As my brother finished his story, he sat down on the bed, seemingly exhausted, or just really scared. As for me, my eyes were watering with terror. Why did he see Dad, and I saw him? And why did neither of us see this person's face? And why did we never hear their footsteps? That night, we stayed up all night, but first we kept the lights on and we stapled some blankets to the windows as we didn't have any curtains or blinds. I don't remember ever being as scared as I was then, and even still, all these decades later, I've never been that scared. Thankfully, nothing else happened that night, nor did anything similar happen for the remainder of our childhood, there in those West Virginia woods. Soon the event became a distant, creepy memory. One that, of course, we shared with our friends who never believed us. They thought these two brothers were just trying to fool them and scare them. I wish I could have told them it was just a prank, but it wasn't. A few years after that, long after my brother moved out to go to college, and just after I moved out to attend my university, I was excited to hear the news that my brother would be graduating. He would be getting his bachelor's in astronomy. I congratulated him over the phone, and he told me he wasn't done yet. He was looking to get his doctorate in astronomy as well. He wanted to study the stars, just like we did in that clearing by the clubhouse. I thought it was amazing, and I was so proud of him. About a week after that, I received another call. This one was from my dad. I remember standing in my dormitory answering the phone and collapsing to my knees. "Son, a drunk driver hit your brother on the road. I'm on my way to pick you up, okay?" "Dad? What do you mean, Dad? Is he okay? I'll see you soon." He didn't give me an answer, and I knew that was a bad sign. I sat there on the floor, choking back tears. I just kept calling my brother's phone over and over and over, expecting someone to answer, even though I knew they wouldn't. When my dad knocked on the dormitory door, I let him in, and it took all the strength I had just to get up. He was already in tears. He hugged me before he said a word, but the first thing he did say as we embraced each other was, "He's gone." There's a feeling you get when you lose your other half, when something that's such a big part of yourself and your life just ceases to exist, when it's ripped away from you. To me, it felt like drowning, like I couldn't breathe, like it wasn't real, sheer and utter and helpless panic. I ended up taking a year off, moving back in with my parents, who still at the time lived at the old house in the woods. Mom was a mess, and Dad had took everything he had to keep going. My old man became angry. The loving man I'd once known was now filled with hatred towards other people, because it was, after all, some stranger who took his son away from him. And my brother had been my mom's pride and joy, a college graduate, getting one step closer to his dreams, all gone because someone couldn't wait to get home to drink. The first night I came back home, I slept in our old room. Then the tears came back that night. But with the pain came a different feeling, a different desire. Deep inside me, something kept telling me that I had to go to the clubhouse, that I couldn't sleep here, that I needed to go to the old treehouse out there to see how it looked and to stay the night. But I knew why those feelings came up. I fought to push them back down, but ultimately I lost. So as not to wake my family, I climbed out the window, bringing nothing but my jacket. I walked into the woods, making my way toward the old clubhouse. The trek was much tougher on my older self than I remembered, but I made it there. And all this time later, it looked just as I recalled, the woods still well maintained. I didn't know how it was possible. I hadn't been back at the clubhouse for a few years. I stopped going when my brother moved off to college. Just didn't see the point. I searched for the old hidden drawstring. I found it and yanked down the rope ladder. I climbed up with some trouble, but eventually pulled myself up. I opened the door and lay down inside. I stared up at the roof and I waited and waited and waited. I wanted to watch outside below the treehouse, but I was afraid it wouldn't come if I was watching. But no matter how long I waited, it wouldn't come. I stayed awake until I saw the first beams of sunrise and the tears came back, because then I really knew I would never be able to see my brother again. And yet I'd come out here, hoping that that thing we saw that night would come back, and I could, at the very least, see my brother facing the other way, asking if he could come up. And that time around, I would have given him an answer. We moved into a farmhouse on Masters Road in Michigan. This farmhouse has a field in the back of it, and beyond the field is woods. In those woods, we've heard sounds, noises that normal animals could not make. One time my dad was outside alone when suddenly he heard one or two loud and unnatural screams coming from those woods. On another occasion, my dad and I were walking in the field and into the woods when we came across a downed tree that had its bark torn right down off its side, as if someone or something had come along and pulled and ripped the bark off. One time when my dad and his significant other were in the field walking, they heard 3 tree knocks coming from the woods. After that, they started hearing grunts and stomping. One night, my dad and I were outside in the backyard. We were listening to a heron going off in the woods by the river, when suddenly we heard those same grunts coming from the woods again. After that, the heron sounded like it was being attacked. Then it all stopped. No sounds were heard, it was just silence. This one gets me. My dad and I were walking in the woods along the side of the river. It had a path going down along the side of it, and we were walking down it, when suddenly for a few seconds we both saw this big black mass dash in between the trees, and followed by it the sounds of breaking branches. Personally, I believe that we have a Bigfoot behind our house. I promise you this really happened, and I hope whatever it is will never get too close to me. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to stay safe out there, because this world is full of strange and terrifying things. If you like and enjoyed these stories, then hit the like button, press the notification bell, and subscribe for more spine-tingling content, and we will see you in the next story.